Welcome, Gothamites, to our first episode of the Arkham Sessions in quite some time. We, of course, are living the pandemic dream right here in our brand new Arkham Sessions studio. I'm Brian Ward, and with me, as always, is my co-host, the psychologist to the superheroes, superheroines, and supervillains of Gotham City and beyond, Dr. Drea Letterman. Hello, Drea.
Hi, Brian.
How are you digging the new space?
It is really nice to be back into our studio. This is a new space for us, and it's different, but it does feel good to be back and to talk about things that we love and to address everything that's been going on and kind of weave things together.
Yeah.
So overall, it's we're certainly blessed to kick off the show again after a little bit of time off.
Yeah, we've been gone for quite some time, and it's for a number of reasons. One, you and I were moving. We moved into a brand new place, and deceptively, it was right next door, which turns out is still not an easy move. So we ran into some serious hurdles with that. Spent a lot of time getting ready. We spent a lot of money getting ready, and we're just basically, we are finally recouped, just mentally and physically.
Well, and not really getting a break. So some of the folks who listen to the show regularly know that I'm a psychologist and work at UCLA. And while I'm not on campus due to the COVID pandemic, I am working every day virtually.
And everything you do involves the campus where there are people.
I thought you were going to say everything you do involves the pandemic, which is pretty much also true.
Yeah, that's accurate.
So I'm glad to have a little bit of a break. This is the Thanksgiving holidays. So we've had a couple days to recenter and to just step away from our day-to-day professional duties and also welcome the show back. So with the new studio and with just a little bit of time off, it's certainly feeling good to again, just to have, I think for me, it's the normalcy. It's like getting back to something that was very routine for us and was very enjoyable, was connecting. This is how we connect with fans and just connect with others who like the things that we are fans of. And so it just has that, very sort of, that it has that comfort that we've been missing. So that's nice.
And I should say, we're not going to skirt the issue. One of the reasons that we were gone was a very personal one, which is, it wasn't comfortable anymore. It wasn't fun anymore. And by that, I mean, not the podcast itself, but the producing of the podcast. And this, I'm just speaking for me. I'm not speaking for you at all. But it got to a point where I started to feel, with everything going on, and I'm talking about everything. I'm talking about my job and working remotely from home. I'm talking about the fact that much of the creativity I get to do in my job, which is creating bonus materials for Blu-rays and DVDs, for months and months and months, I couldn't do because you can't do that from home. I mean, we've sort of figured out a way to do it with Zoom and things like that, but it wasn't the same, and people aren't as willing to come out and start talking about old movies they loved quite as readily as they were before the pandemic. And so much of my creativity was getting sucked away into this sort of abyss of just not being able to go out and actually do it. And my motivation for doing much of anything was sort of drained. I woke up every morning, I did my work, and the fact that we were doing it here at the home meant that there was very little separation between office time and home time, and that started to burn me out. I was getting fatigued from that for sure, and then the idea of then setting up a mixer and a computer and some microphones, and then to spend a couple of hours editing each and every show, it just became this idea of more and more work. And I'm not going to use the term depression because I know that we've talked before about the irresponsibility of saying, oh, I'm so depressed and whatever. I don't think I was feeling depression, but I was certainly feeling fatigue. I was feeling burnout. I was feeling unmotivated to do anything that wasn't just waking up every day and doing my job.
Right. But I have to say, that I'm so glad that you're being honest about that. And I'm relating to this so much because we're in very different fields. And although I was I'm still working in the field I was working in before, the fatigue that you're talking about, the day-to-day exhaustion, is not only that we're managing and adjusting in a new environment away from the connections and the social support of a work or office environment, but that we are constantly managing our health. So whether it's on the forefront of your mind or maybe a subconscious idea, we are every day, even if you're not going outside, you're managing your health. You're at some level navigating and tuning into the needs of your body. Am I being safe? Am I protecting myself from COVID? And that is a strain. And I know we've talked about COVID on the show before. Human beings are exceptionally resilient, and we adjust so fast. What takes some time, though, is the psychological piece of that. And certainly what's different about this crisis is its enduring quality. This is a very prolonged situation. I was in college during 9/11, another crisis that impacted us on a national and global level. And why I talk about that crisis is to pinpoint its duration. That we were certainly fearful, we were panicked, we were actually starting a recovery process at a very fixed point in time. Whereas with COVID, we're not yet in that recovery process. Yeah. So I think what I'm trying to convey here is that the exhaustion that you say is not quite depression, but is a fatigue, a mental fatigue, is certainly real. And psychologists are studying and observing why COVID fatigue might be a little bit different than, say, clinical depression or other types of mental distress. And it is due to the loss of social support. It's due to the loss of daily routine, daily social and interpersonal routine. And I think a lot of this, again, has to do with how we're constantly managing our health in the context of losing so much support and losing so much connectivity to people that we used to be able to see and relate to. And I felt similarly. I do have to say that we're still in it, it's hard. Yeah. I'm appreciating that you're being honest about it, because we're not immune to how this pandemic impacts us. So yeah, I think we're doing the best that we can.
Yeah. One of those things too was sort of what we're talking about today is you and I started this podcast because you especially had a deep love of Batman the Animated Series. And while I didn't necessarily have a deep love of Batman the Animated Series, I enjoyed it very much. I could rely on each week watching an episode that I was probably going to like. I can think of very few exceptions where I didn't like an episode. And even if I didn't like the episode, we certainly had a lot of interesting things to say about it. Then we came up to the end of Batman the Animated Series, and we started doing Doom Patrol. And that one became a little bit more work because they were hour-long episodes. They were very dense with material. It was a show that was almost written to be analyzed by a psychologist. It became a lot more work. I enjoyed the show significantly more than you did. Maybe it's because of how much work you were having to put into it. You also talked about the quirkiness of the show. But then that season came to an end, and we suddenly found ourselves needing to cover something else. And we left that open to our patrons over at Patreon, and they chose Steven Universe. This is a show that neither of us know anything about. We've been promised that it's great. We've been promised that we will have a lot to talk about, but it's one of those things where you sit there and go, oh my God, we are now going completely into the unknown. Even with Doom Patrol, we had seen most of the first season before we even decided to cover it.
And you were quite familiar with the comics. Yeah, I had maybe a very superficial knowledge of it, but you knew full well about this bizarre world we were entering.
Yeah, so this idea of Steven Universe is now even a little I'm not going to say I feel great anxiety about each episode going in and just being like, oh God, I'm hoping that I just simply enjoy it from an entertainment standpoint, but B, I really hope that the stories and characters are worthy of your analysis. And so that became a little daunting as well. Now, to be fair, if you've looked at the episode title for this episode of the podcast, we threw out to our patrons, do you want to jump right into Steven Universe, or do you want to go back to something that we all know that we already love, which is Batman, and cover a trilogy that surprisingly in the years that we've been doing this podcast have never touched on, and that's the Nolan trilogy. And there was an overwhelming amount of response to that poll. And it was, yes, they want us to cover the Nolan trilogy before jumping into Steven Universe, which I'm happy to do. And that's what we're going to start talking about today. Batman Begins, directed by Christopher Nolan and written by Christopher Nolan and David Goyer. This is a movie that I know you and I have seen a number of times.
I did have to watch it again because I realized it had been some time since I'd seen it last.
But when you say have to, you wanted to watch it.
Oh, it was a delight. I mean, it's interesting. You probably remember when you saw it for the first time in theaters. It was a big deal.
Yeah, 2005. It was the first time in a long while that Warner Brothers was actively trying to push Batman back into the darker realm. And because Christopher Nolan was at the helm, we sort of knew the kind of character he was going to go for. He is a very psychologically driven, very action oriented, but very deep character development guy. I mean, this is the guy who made Memento, for God's sakes. So this is a guy who is very interested in storytelling when it comes to character. And he was partnered up with David Goyer, who isn't necessarily known for the same thing. He's certainly a guy who has written, I'm not going to lie, he's written a bunch of movies that I actually really enjoy. So I'm not going to apologize for enjoying seeing David Goyer's name up on a big screen, but he's got a reputation of being strictly a comic book to screen kind of guy, where it's simple, it's action oriented, it's usually pretty dark, and some people are into it and some people aren't. But
wouldn't you say that Batman Begins was for many people now like an entry point or an introduction to the deeper storytelling around Batman's psychology that folks who didn't read, I mean, the comic books of the late 80s, early mid 90s were serious.
Yeah.
These are the books that you and I kind of grew up on. These are the books that drew me into the psychology of Batman. And I have to say that the films were mostly, I think the Burton films were, of course, centered around a despairing character, a character who's intriguing, a character who is mysterious, who is different, who is uniquely driven. I think that captures a lot. But, there was some time before the Nolan trilogy where Batman as a live action superhero was lighthearted and more of an idea, more of like a it was almost like back to a campy version, and back to the notion of dressing up as a bat to fight crime.
Yeah, I mean,
less so the deeper analogies and the deeper storytelling that we would have seen in the comics.
Well, we had gone from Tim Burton to Schumacher, who insisted that his color palette look like a cartoon strip. I mean, he wanted it to be bold and bright. He wanted Batman to have a sense of humor. He wanted there to be melodramatic tones, but he really wanted it to be campy.
Well, and all the characters were hyperbole. Like everybody was sort of out there, but not for a deeper reason other than to be just big egos. Like it wasn't much behind. I'm not saying I didn't like it. I'm just saying that these films brought in folks who were really able to tap into deeper themes.
And I think part of that is to Warner Brothers. It's Warner Brothers' decision to broaden the audience to make more money. So the fact that you've got Tim Burton Batman that is sort of dark, and then you've got Batman Returns, which some could argue similar to Temple of Doom, was even darker.
For sure.
And
one of my favorite Batman movies.
That's true. And then I think they decided to just shift it in an entirely different direction. And by the end, we are back to the Adam West Batman of 66, where George Clooney genuinely holds up a Batman
charge card,
credit card.
Yeah.
I mean, it's ridiculous.
Well, let's see. So interestingly, this is 2005. That's when Batman Begins was released. Mm-hmm. One of the Harry Potters, it was the Goblet of Fire, was out. V for Vendetta.
So if it was Goblet of Fire, then we're already talking about a darker movie.
We had V for Vendetta, an amazing movie. You had Constantine.
And V for Vendetta was Alan, V for Vendetta was an adaptation of Alan Moore. So
and then you had Sin City. Not as popular as some of these others that I'm naming, but again,
it was another Frank Miller
dark adaptation. You had Revenge of the Sith, one of the darker of certainly a profoundly I would say for the prequel trilogy probably the most fascinating and certainly the darkest. King Kong. I don't remember which King Kong this is, but
that would have been Peter Jackson.
Okay, because there were so many. So the original Descent, Fantastic Four.
That can be ignored.
Yeah, we'll just ignore that. But I think it's fascinating that this was the time. I do remember that this was an era, right, of storytelling, and especially for the beginning of this trilogy being a profoundly impactful introduction for many people to the story of Batman and Bruce Wayne, and why it was so important that the movie be centered around his original childhood trauma of losing his parents to this random, horrific murder in Gotham City.
Yeah, and this, of course, was loosely based on at least the ideas of Batman Year One, which was a Frank Miller book published in '87 by DC Comics. It wanted to explore the genuine origins of Bruce Wayne, because let's be honest, if you're a comic book fan, and especially a DC comic book fan, many of those stories and much of that origin is just sort of it's a gray mess. There isn't a whole lot of genuine continuity between writers that tells you what the origin of Batman really was, beyond simply a dark alley, a mugger, his parents ending up dead, pearls surrounding him as a little boy, usually on his knees, is like looking up to the sky and crying. And then maybe being in his library, his study, and a bat comes crashing in through the window. That's sort of the only real origin we know about Batman. And so Frank Miller took it upon himself to write the first year in his story. And while this movie does not borrow heavily too much from that specific story, it certainly takes the same very serious tone about a guy who left Gotham City, has now come back, and mysteriously seems to be prepared to take on the criminal world. let's talk about Bruce Wayne a little bit. Played by Christian Bale, this is one of those quintessential portrayals of Bruce Wayne. And maybe that's fair or unfair to say. Maybe it's too obvious because there just haven't been that many portrayals of Bruce Wayne on screen. So clearly Christian Bale is going to be one of those people that you remember. He did play him for 3 movies, which is more than any of his feature film predecessors. Michael Keaton, of course, did 2. Val Kilmer did 1. George Clooney did 1. Adam West did 1 feature film. So you could easily say Christian Bale might be the defining Bruce Wayne, which I think is it's a fair assessment. This is probably one of the first examples of clear-cut lines between the personalities of Bruce Wayne, and Batman, in my opinion. You brought up that Michael Keaton, that there's a little bit of a line in there. Michael
Keaton's Batman / Bruce Wayne dichotomy is an early version of what we're seeing with Christian Bale, in that there's a nuance to his public persona. He has self-awareness. He knows that to some degree people look to him as a high-profile, very visible, very powerful billionaire. He understands the power he holds. He plays with that a little bit. Certainly tries to. I think he when he can, he avoids that persona. He knows that he can influence others with it. Christian Bale's version is the one that I think I understand the most. This is the version that I think is similar to the animated series version, which is where I think this exists in some way.
And it's usually in a voice, like with the animated series. So when I say that it's the most clear-cut line, I mean like live action on screen. Kevin Conroy is certainly credited for having delivered a different voice for Batman as Bruce Wayne. But let's be honest, even his Batman voice was mostly his Bruce voice when he was in the manor alone with Alfred. In fact, I would even make fun of the fact that Batman just hung out in his Batman outfit while only being with people like Alfred. You've got a guy who is careful enough to disguise his voice and whatnot when he is in costume. But while in the Batmobile or in the Batwing or sitting on top of a gargoyle somewhere in Gotham City, he will mic check back to someone he calls Alfred. And doesn't disguise. They don't use code words. They don't disguise those elements. This is a Bruce Wayne and a Batman where Bruce is pretty serious. He is a straight shooter, knows exactly what he wants. He has a plan to get there. Bruce Wayne is a douche. He is a guy that is every bit that rich kid with the silver spoon who can have anything he wants, and he flaunts it. And what I think is brilliant about that is it's the first time we've ever seen, because let's look back at Batman the Animated Series. Bruce Wayne was never a dick. He was never a horrible person to the people around him.
Right.
He was a philanthropist. He was a playboy, known for the lady, being around the ladies, but was never known for just being an irresponsible person. This incarnation of Bruce Wayne takes that and turns it on its ear. Bruce Wayne is a person you do not want to hang out with. He is irresponsible, pig-headed, a womanizer to the nth degree, and is just sort of a horrible person to be around, gets drunk, gets wasted, starts buying hotels, or whatever. Actually, that's in the next one. But
this is so in your mind, what is the motivation for me? My understanding is this is his own. So thinking about Bruce's motivation.
Yeah.
This is a rejection of the greed and the capitalism and the power dynamic of the city, and the need to participate in that in some way, because he's the wealthiest person with all this influence. He has to participate in some way, and he has to throw the scent off of what's happening in the underground.
Well, yes, I don't see it as being a condemnation of greed and wealth and whatever. I see it more as a straightforward mask similar to his cowl. He is going to throw the scent off of the fact that he is Batman by making himself visibly and publicly the worst possible guess for who Batman might be.
So like, how could this selfish, reckless person even be capable of the sophistication, the intellect, the mystery, all the work that this vigilante has to do?
And by the way, this is one of the levels of brilliance by doing this, is by making him a night owl, by making him someone who goes out and stays out all night drinking God knows what. And let's be honest, the man's drinking water for sure, but he's putting on this act of.
I know. I mean, I guess why I'm saying this is his rejection of this, of the inherent setup of the city or the inherent setup of the system. I think I guess my interpretation is that he knows he must participate in it.
He's mocking it.
Yeah, like this is his way of, almost enjoying spitting at the face of this system because he has the power and the authority to do so. Yeah. He makes himself wildly visible as this character. Mm-hmm. And you're right, it makes him the least possible candidate for a superhero who's ostensibly up all night following each trace of these criminals.
No one questions why Bruce Wayne is not seen during the day, because they know he was out all night. Like there's never that question. Whereas I would strongly question why the Kevin Conroy Bruce Wayne was not seen during the day. And in fact, I wonder when he sleeps, because he's out all night and then you do see him at work.
He didn't need to sleep. He had so much adrenaline.
That's true. Yeah. But this character is a character that is so laser focused on presenting this persona so that you never once get the inkling that he could be this man in a bat suit, mm-hmm. Taking down the criminals.
Well, I think the other effect of this is the aspect of detachment, that clearly this is someone not to get too close to. This is someone who is out for, just the entertainment and the fun and the irresponsibility of this lifestyle. This isn't someone you fall in love with. This isn't someone you have a trusting connection with. Yeah. But this is a protective thing. He does this in order to keep people away from him. Mm-hmm. He wants to be somehow or somewhat unattachable, almost unapproachable. Yeah. He wants his reputation to be this this kind of fickle, unlikable guy.
The billionaire playboy.
Yeah. And the element of this is that he, therefore, doesn't risk getting close to people. He is 100%. Then, repelling all of these potential social connections. And I think psychologically there's this piece of, I will burn you before you can burn me. I think some of this is
his plan.
Well, yeah, some of it is his plan, but I think some of it is also a bit of a defense mechanism. Like, yeah, this works for me, but also this on a deeper level, this works for me because I'm scared. I'm scared to be close to people.
Well, and I think part of that too, it's an interesting conversation to have, because I don't think it's a defense mechanism in the moment. I think it was a defense mechanism months ago when he decided to put this character on, when he was away learning his arts, his martial arts on sheets of ice with Ra's al Ghul, Roz in this particular movie. I'll let him have that. But I think he, when laying out his foolproof plan for becoming a vigilante that terrified the cowardly criminal lot in Gotham City, I think he made the conscious decision to put up that defense mechanism to avoid personal relationships, to avoid all of that. And I think he's just carrying that out going forward. I think it explains too that if you never see him with the same girl on his arm or multiple girls on his arm from one night to the next, none of those girls are going to get a foothold. None of those girls are going to get into the Batcave. None of those girls are going to become the future Mrs. Bruce Wayne, because it is all going according to his plan. He doesn't even know these girls' names. Now, to one degree, that makes you sort of a dick on the surface anyway, but lower than that, he is just using these people around him as pawns to help shield him from, so he genuinely doesn't know these people's names. He doesn't care to know these people's names.
Well, but that's the deeper piece that I'm saying is this all has a strategic function,
100%.
and the emotional function that may be less obvious to him. The emotional function is that he remains detached or unattached to people, which his original trauma, of course, is related to sudden, unexpected loss of people who he cared about deeply. He truly wants to avoid that at all costs. So this is the perfect, masterful plan to function at a level of, at an intellectual level, but also, and by the way, as a moral level, to pursue his mission, and more subconsciously as an emotional strategy to keep anyone from being close to them. The exception, of course, is Rachel, who is is original to this story. This is not a character who, to my knowledge, is inspired by any particular comic story.
Correct.
But works really well to get us, we're kind of the Rachel. Like we're trying to better understand how to, we're trying to better understand him, but we're also in that journey of this mysterious, this mysterious pursuit.
So in the same way that he is showing her and all of those around her this awful character, he also wants her to like him the same way that he wants us, the audience, to like him and trust him.
Exactly. And so that's why, because he has to be, Batman has to be a likable character, one that we sympathize with, one that we root for, we cheerlead for. And so her story, I think it's a good storyline. She's his childhood friend. She is someone who has this pretty deep connection with when they're youngsters. There is a rupture because of his parents' death. And he essentially abandons his identity. He abandons his old self, as you said, to go pursue this new self, which I definitely want to talk about. And when they reunite, when he reunites with Rachel, there is this continued need for her to see him as the old Bruce, someone who is humble, someone who is helpful, someone who is more like, I guess, the Batman than this Bruce Wayne persona that he's trying to, in one scene, he even finds himself struggling to code switch because he's in public as Bruce Wayne and runs into Rachel and she's like completely baffled by, like, she sort of doesn't recognize.
Put off
she
by
doesn't recognize this, and he has to navigate that code switching with her because he still feels very connected to her.
He's trying to send the signals to her that he's still a good guy,
Right.
while also maintaining this public persona. Let's talk about those parents that have left him. Naturally, we've talked about Thomas and Martha on several occasions over the course of this show, but I think this movie is interesting because it's the first time in a long while that I can think of where a significant focus was put onto Thomas. Thomas, played by Linus Roach, and Martha, played by Sarah Stewart, is I think the persona, the portrayal of Thomas is a pretty good one in this. It's the first time that we have really seen a character, even though it's in flashbacks, genuinely show you the Thomas Wayne that we've always heard of, the philanthropist who is the billionaire, but also seems like a genuinely nice guy, like this sort of fatherly figure.
There's that scene, and I know I'm interrupting you, but like they kind of take us through a tour of the city.
Yeah.
And
I did that.
And Thomas is like, I own all of this. Like it's but it's not, it's almost like, oh, it's a weird comfort. It's like, just, you should know, little Bruce Wayne, little, 8-year-old Bruce Wayne, you should know, you should be comforted in knowing all of this technology, all this transportation, all of this infrastructure is fundamentally yours.
And I've got that audio. I want to play it because I think it's important to listen to some of the other things that he talks about here. Let's take a listen.
Did you build this train, Dad?
Gotham's been good to our family, but the city's been suffering. People less fortunate than us have been enduring very hard times. So we built a new, cheap public transportation system to unite the city. And at the center, Wayne Tower.
Is that where you work?
No, I work at the hospital. I leave the running of our company to much better men.
Better?
Wow, more interested men.
So this is one of those moments where I think it really exemplifies what I've always said about Bruce, where I think he would just be a more effective hero if he were basically just the philanthropist who used his billions of dollars to help the infrastructure of the city. Now, the problem is the city is currently corrupt. You're seeing that Thomas is trying to do that. He is genuinely putting his money toward helping the city and the people of the city. And he is not just a figurehead. And I really appreciate getting that peek into Thomas. And I also will admit that this is the first story where I've seen them try to show you how it would fail if Bruce also tried the same thing. So Bruce realizes, I can't just be that good guy that my dad was. I have to terrify the bad guys. And then, where I think is a problem is knowing the end point, the end game. At what point do you put the costume away and then become your dad, as opposed to constantly just terrifying and re-terrifying the same people over and over and over again.
It's important for us to learn that after the death of Thomas and Martha, there's a period of time Bruce is away. And in those years, the mobsters take control of the city. There's a clear deterioration of the system. And not to say that that's, I'm agreeing with you, but I'm realizing that he comes back to a very different landscape than the one that raised him, per se.
But then let's talk about the surrogate father. What I find interesting about this particular version of Alfred, as played by Michael Caine, and by the way, I would easily put this version of Alfred as my top Alfred of all time, because Michael Caine not only is just a brilliant, amazing actor, he has the same kindness in his heart that Thomas appears to have before his death. He appears to genuinely look and love. He looks upon Bruce like a son and loves him like a son. But he also has a devotion to his family that he has never been able to give up. So you can see Alfred struggle with this idea of putting their little boy in danger every single night, and yet still try to support that boy that he has known since he was a child. So this to me is the Alfred that I've always loved, that shows this dichotomy, that shows this struggle with what it means to be the butler of Bruce Wayne, the surrogate parent, the guardian of a kid that will become the guardian of the entire city. And I really, really appreciate that. Every other incarnation of Alfred, and I'll even throw Michael Goff in here as well, seems to be dedicated to Bruce solely. Michael Goff makes references to Thomas and Martha, and I know there's the scene, right before Batman gets dressed for the one more time in 89, where, he doesn't want to live the rest of his life mourning his friends or their son. But this is my perfect Alfred, I think.
I am seeing some of the connecting features, because just to comment on Thomas a little bit, this trilogy, by the way, really fundamentally centers around the aspects of Bruce's first fearful experiences. That the very first trauma that he endured wasn't the death of his parents.
Yeah.
It was falling, maybe 50 feet into a hole that was behind Wayne Manor, that ultimately leads him to create the Batcave. Mm-hmm. But it was that fall and the introduction to the darkness, the uncertainty, the risk, all the things that fall, the bats, like all the thing that fall is associated with, was his introduction into profound fear. Mm-hmm. And all the things that the body feels, all the things that the brain comes up with, just the whole experience of complete loss of control to something that's profoundly uncertain, ambiguous, and life-threatening. What I love about this version is that they included this like trauma that happens, I would say, within months of his parents' death. And when Thomas comes down to rescue him, so what's so important about this is the father's interpretation that he lends to his son. And this is crucial for all of us, because one of the biggest predictors of our recovery after any level of trauma is our interpretation. What does this mean?
The learning moment.
It is that learning moment. So for Thomas to say simply, "You'll be okay." And we have the clip of this.
Bruce. It's okay. It's okay. You'll be okay.
Took quite a fall, didn't we, Master Bruce?
And why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves up. The bats again. You know why they attacked you, don't you? They were afraid of you.
Afraid of me?
All creatures feel fear,
Even the scary ones.
especially the scary ones.
This is not this is a rational comfort. This is not this is not, you're always going to be okay. It's right now, I've got you, you're going to be okay. And why this is really crucial is that it helps Bruce form some ideas about falling. Which, I mean, this is the entirety of the first movie, right? The reason why it's important to get up, the reason why it's important to reflect on the fall, the reason it's important to understand how you will fall again and how you will get up even faster and be even stronger. And that's the element of human hardship that is so crucial to our ongoing resilience and endurance. It is the reflection of why do we fall, but it's also somebody comforting you and saying, you're going to be okay. If the father had been absent, or the caregiver had been absent, or if the message was, you fell because of your own damn fault, like whatever other interpretation could be, or like, see, like you could have died. What I think those would have built in potentially some other pathways for him that interpret hardships as very different than this one. And what I think the entirety of this story, at least in the first movie, revolves around is this aspect of fear is real. What are you going to do with that fear? And all these different characters, certainly the Scarecrow manipulates fear. The Scarecrow capitalizes from people's fear. Mm-hmm. Certainly the aspects of Batman try to control fear in some way. Certainly Ra's al Ghul is utilizing fear in his own manipulation, his own relationship with Bruce Wayne. So it becomes this common thread that tells this initial story that's extremely, extremely important.
Okay, you just mentioned the Scarecrow. Let's talk a little bit about him. I'm sure you, of all people, have a lot to say about this guy who works in the mental health industry.
I love this version of him though, because he's in the system and kind of I think there's a lot of. I guess what I like is that he's just not played as a wildly kooky, like, oh, that man is just crazy and just doing some crazy stuff. That he's certainly formulating a part of his plan, like he's certainly a part of this bigger system. He's not, I guess what I'm saying is that he's not really about the chaos. He's driven to manipulate people's chaotic abilities or chaotic defaults when they're exposed to their deepest fears. But I appreciate that he's not just pursuing chaos. I think he's a little bit more sophisticated than that.
Yeah. But he's also not portrayed as just the mad scientist that just wants to learn more about fear. He's not that guy either. He's somewhere in the middle where he's just a really unethical guy who is, maybe it's unfair to say, is he, would you put him in that level of like sort of sociopathic, because he certainly seems to revel in the torture of other people, but not for scientific purposes. It's very much a,
well, and this isn't really his origin. He's already formulated and mastered the toxin. He's already figured it out how to utilize it. So it's more about, I mean, he is the weapon. Yeah. And it's more about him playing a part in this bigger story. But again, he is operating in this bigger component where there's like a crisis. Like he wants to create this crisis for a bigger purpose. Mm-hmm. But the reason why this first movie is really centered on a fear-based structure, on human fear, is that every element of this third act is about the city undergoing this massive crisis.
Okay, so you're talking about the third act. I want to talk about the third act a little bit because it brings our two villains together. Ra's al Ghul returns to Gotham City. We learned that Ducard, the character played by Liam Neeson, was actually Ra's al Ghul, possibly all along. What I love about this incarnation of Ra's al Ghul is that his immortality is explained away by Ra's al Ghul being an idea, and that any person could be that idea. And so,
well, this is what he wants Bruce Wayne to do with Batman. That he and this is why this kind of raises this film to a more, I guess, a more sophisticated element about the superhero. That the idea is that he becomes an ideal. He becomes the symbol rather than a single person.
And there is one line that I really like here too. I'll play it. It's a moment of Ducard and Bruce as he reveals himself in Gotham City. Here we go.
Well, you took my advice about theatricality a bit literally.
It's a little too theatrical.
Yeah, so he's sort of laughing at this concept while acknowledging that it really is an idea that he had. But Ducard and slash Ra's al Ghul's whole plan is to bring Gotham to the ground. He just wants to raise the place. He is comparing it to empires of old that have come into power and have become too powerful and too quote unquote great, and therefore needs to be brought back down to earth, needs to have the hubris kicked out from underneath them. And his idea basically is to unlock the prisoners from the prison, bring them off the island to Gotham City proper, unleash the fear toxin so that essentially the entire city just kills themselves. They kill each other. There's a war. You've got psychopaths that have come off a prison island, and then you've got normal people who are already terrified, and you're just going to put everybody together. And so the plan is that by the end of the night, or shortly thereafter, Gotham will cease to exist. And
meanwhile, the fear toxin is producing some of the most bizarre, frightening, horrific beliefs and attitudes. So they're operating on their deepest suggestions, their deepest projections of what might happen. And so there's this fight or flight, a literal version of like a citywide fight or flight. I'm not sure that results in the whole city going down, but it's certainly damaging.
But by the way, I appreciate more than any time I've seen it in anything else, I appreciate the nightmarish visions that we get in this movie. I appreciate that it's not just, oh, I see snakes, oh, I see bugs coming out of the walls.
All the phobias.
It is a man on a horse in front of me, and that horse has flaming eyes. I mean, he might as well be death incarnate right there in front of him, right there in front of Rachel in this moment. Mm-hmm. And when Batman has Crane has Cillian Murphy there, and he puts the gas into Crane's face, Crane begins to see, and I love the performances in this movie, and Cillian Murphy is probably one of the better examples, because in this moment, you watch as Jonathan Crane, like just watch his eyes. Jonathan Crane's eyes go from being terrified of this black demonic mass in front of him to an acceptance of the fear. He just checks out. And you just sort of, and it's ever so brief and ever so subtle, but you watch as a man who has built his life on fear just gives into it. And it almost becomes, it looks like it's almost euphoric. And so I appreciate.
Well, it can be. I mean, maybe he succumbs, like this could be a very adrenaline producing experience, and he gives himself up to it. So yeah, I think that's always how you go after Crane. You have to use his own toxin against him.
Yeah, pretty much.
I think his character is really great in this because he ends up being, I understand that he ends up being sort of a a B villain to this A villain, that he's not really the one we're after. But he is, so like it really lifts up and highlights again this common theme in this movie, that we're supposed to be exploring and examining fear. We're supposed to understand fear as a weapon, as something that can literally destroy the city. Like, that is what this villain is doing. But it also is telling us that our hero is shaped and formed by his fearful experience, and that he is learning how to control it. He's learning how to interpret it. He's learning how to live with it. And he's also learning, as we talked about with relationships, he's learning how to avoid it by being so detached. And there's these elements, I think there's these different layers of fear as a theme in this film that that has us really embracing a more complex relationship with fear. It's not just, oh, it's a bad thing. It's, oh, this is a really important part, a crucial part of our human psychology. And we've got to figure out what side of this are we on. Yeah. How do we live with this?
Yeah. There are a couple other characters I want to talk about, but I want to talk about them later. I want to talk about them in the movies to come. Specifically, I'm thinking of Jim Gordon, played by Gary Oldman. I want to talk about him because I feel like we're going to get more of what we want to talk about a little later. Right now, we're seeing him. He's a little young, and he's a little. He's not in control. He's not in power yet, to the degree that we sort of want to talk about that character. Another character that I want to talk about a little bit later is Morgan Freeman's Lucius Fox. In the next movie especially, Lucius becomes a character that I want to discuss at great lengths, specifically as we start to talk about ethics and we start to talk about the morality of being this Batman character.
Supplier.
Yeah. Well, and of being Batman himself, because I think that Lucius is responsible for helping instill even more of those ethical qualities into Bruce, and whether Bruce always had those things in mind or not, I think is kind of irrelevant, because I think he's still gleaming things off of those around him, those personal relationships that are pivotal to him, people like Alfred and people like Lucius. I think that it really helps define that character, and I want to talk about that in the next movie. Did you have any other thoughts on Batman Begins? I realize we've not gone through the whole movie, but it's kind of a long movie, and we've all seen it. But we really want to break down these characters. Did you have any other thoughts that you had about this film? Things that you may have loved, things you may not have loved? Or is there anything about this film that you looked at and just sort of said, yeah, I don't know that I buy into that?
No, I would say that the turning points are really fascinating. Like the League of Shadows, the do you want to be a member? You could be a member of the League of Shadows. The rejection of that possible community. Now there may be reasons why, right? Ra's al Ghul says, you have to let go of your compassion. You really can't have empathy. This is all really well-controlled psychology. And interestingly, Bruce denies, he rejects that affiliation. He does not want to be a part of this type of society that wants to, it's not even reinvention. It's just burning down and rebirth. And I think that's a sort of a nice counterpart to what story he's been telling, which is, no, you actually, you fall, you get hurt, you assess, and then you build from that. You don't start from scratch. You don't completely forget all of the past setbacks and the failures and the various, all of those built up memories, so to speak. And so that's kind of a nice counterpart of the villain saying, no, you don't build from those memories. You just start anew. Whereas Bruce is really having this identity formation that we're a part of. And I mean, that's literally becoming Batman. Like that's how we understand this character to develop.
Yeah.
So that's kind of cool. I do appreciate the pieces of this around the relationship with him and Rachel, especially toward the end, and how there's, he's a much more full, richer version emotionally than the characters we might have seen who play, or the versions of Batman that we've seen before.
But once again, as always, we just can't. We can't have a version of Batman that doesn't give away his own identity to multiple people. In the same way that, like he's constantly letting people in when he just shouldn't be. Now, how did you feel about the ending? The famous
I won't kill you. But I don't have to save you.
Well, I think the subtlety of the conversations Lucius has with Bruce have some of these elements. Like, this stuff can kill people. Are we all good with that? Like, it's not as articulated as I'm describing it, but it is. I think there are moments of we're reaching a point where you're using all of this military wear, all this technology and equipment. Someone's going to get hurt. Are we all fine with this?
And in this case, it's his father's own L train that ends up killing.
Yeah, I mean that's symbolic, right? Which is so fascinating because Roz tells him to be bigger than himself.
Yeah.
He tells him, "You must be a legend. You must be bigger than your name. You are an idea." And so I think it's sort of bittersweet that Batman embraces that with this destruction of this glorified transportation system, the glorified center of the city,
and Wayne Manor.
Yeah, I mean it's like, how's this for being bigger than me?
Yeah.
Like let me make a big statement.
Yeah, my whole name is going to disappear now, basically, because you have destroyed my family legacy, and now I've got to become something bigger than that.
It was nice to go back to something that predates the pandemic. There's some comfort in watching stuff that is, anything that's before 2020 seems to have its own inherent comfort. But it's interesting that this film in particular, as I said, centers and frames its story around the experience of fear and how we interpret, manage, and overcome those inherent experiences, right? The crisis that we're experiencing is also very much based in fear. Like, we're fearful of getting a virus. We're fearful of contaminating or putting others at risk of this virus. And I think a lot of us...
We're fearful of politics. I mean, the whole world around us is centered on fear at this point.
There's a lot of tiptoeing there, and there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a fear of not knowing when this is going to end. There's a fear of not knowing whether we will have jobs. There's a sort of layers and layers of fearful cognitions. And whenever we're in a crisis like this, we have to think about the ways in which we are susceptible to a certain psychological and emotional biases, especially if we're managing and enduring this for a long period of time. The first thing that we were kind of talking about is, you opened this episode with acknowledging that you've had some level of distress, that you were really feeling a heaviness and more difficulty getting things done. And I want to name that because I said that I was also experiencing this, and I'm sure other people have some similar takes and similar emotional reactions to COVID. Allostatic load is what I would really kind of name as the shared experience we have, and something that is really referring to the stress system.
So let's repeat that. What is that?
Oh, allostatic load. It's the cost of chronic and extreme wear and tear on our bodies, our minds, our emotions. Allostatic load occurs when demands in our internal resources exceed our capacity. It's sort of like you've tapped out, and it really occurs because we have, again, as I mentioned, we've been enduring chronic stressors. And so you basically kind of wear out your internal resources. And the fear fueled by this pandemic, this crisis, puts extreme pressure on our external resources as well as our internal resources. So this could mean not having access to social support, having financial strain, just having physical strain and so forth. So I think, you were talking about feeling exhausted and just kind of feeling the heaviness. This is what I would call our overwhelmed self, that we have, we're navigating various aspects and various selves. And some people might say this is our survival self because we're constantly in fight or flight mode. But I think that overwhelmed self can likely capture what a lot of us are experiencing.
Okay, then as I brought up the stuff in the beginning and you have talked about it and you're mentioning it here. I guess maybe something I can ask you is, for myself and for those at home experiencing the same thing, what exactly can we do about it?
Well, there are certainly some very achievable coping strategies that we could do right now as we speak. One of the first things we need to do, especially because we are tapped out or feeling like we're tapped out, is to just take a step back and name the feeling. And I often do this with the students I work with. I do this for myself. We could do this together. It's simply naming the emotion or the feeling that we have and, just kind of gaining awareness of where we're at. So the reason naming it helps is that it gives us some distance from the feeling. Mm-hmm. Often psychologists call this psychological distancing because you're kind of taking a detached position on it and looking at it in more of a third person and better understanding, okay, what is this feeling? What is the intensity of the feeling? What is the duration of the feeling? The second part is to calm yourself. So this can be whatever strategy is helpful for you to calm the body. For some people, it is a prolonged meditation. For others, it's simply taking a moment to breathe. Okay. If folks want the more achievable, like short-term version, think about taking breaths in the following way. Breathe in for 3 seconds, breathe out for 6, in for 3, out for 6.
Aren't you eventually just going to hyperventilate because you're
for some people it can be very challenging to just focus on this, but the reason that this is soothing and the reason this can help center ourselves is that you're paying attention, you're counting, you're thinking about the breath, you're thinking about your body, and prolonging that exhale is a way to calm the system down.
Okay.
And I would say, practicing this makes it a little bit easier.
Right.
Movement. In addition to calming the body through breath, maybe get out and move your body, do jumping jacks, run for 10 minutes, again, whatever your body is capable of doing, get that body to move because that helps discharge stress. And then finally, reflection. So take the time to reflect and give yourself some affirmations. This is essentially speaking to your survival sense, speaking to that overwhelmed self. Tell yourself what it is realistically that you need. Now, how this works with the story that we've just been looking at is that is essentially what Thomas Wayne is doing for Bruce. He's instilling this sense of, here are the things you need to tell yourself when you have fallen, and you need to work yourself back up. You need to realign and center yourself. You need to understand and realize that you will be okay. And the framing of this and the types of things we tell ourselves has a lot to do with the possibility that this is temporary, the possibility that we will get out of this crisis, the possibility that we will survive. And the reason it's helpful is that it combats some of the natural feelings and some of the natural thoughts that might come to mind, like, I'm not going to get through this. I won't survive. I'm helpless. I don't have any, nothing can help me. Having those affirmations and those statements of hope, those statements of next steps, the statements that are proactive, give us that adjustment we need to do in order to keep moving. And in order for, as Thomas suggests, like this is what we need to learn about the situation. And this is how we can proceed from here versus just staying stuck in that hole.
Right. All right. Well, then I'm gonna try that as soon as we get off the podcast. I'm going to inhale for 3 count, exhale for 6 count. I'm getting rid of twice as much oxygen.
No. You'll be fine.
I guess I'm not really getting rid of the oxygen. I'm getting rid of the carbon dioxide. But okay. All right. Well, then I'm going to try it. Drea, are you looking forward to next time where we're talking about The Dark Knight and you get to talk about, anarchy and your favorite character, the Joker,
yes.
and it's going to be awesome. Join us next time. Until then, Drea, why don't you tell folks where they can find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Arkham Asylum Doc and on Instagram, Arkham Asylum Doc. You can find my website, drdreapsychology.com, where some articles, some podcast episodes, and some videos are there. Please check it out.
If you have Disney Plus, you can turn on your TVs right now and you can actually see Drea in an episode of their new docuseries, Marvel Earth 616.
This has been such a fun show to see come out because we did these interviews more than a year ago. I would say like October of 2019, back when the show wasn't really like fully cemented. I think they were still sort of working on the different documentaries. So when they approached me, they did not say like, hey, we're doing a docuseries about the lives of people who are fans of Marvel and who are inspired, enlightened, and receive a lot of joy from the Marvel universe in various ways. We want you to be a part of the storytelling. It was mainly like, hey, like we have some questions for you about Marvel cosplayers and the psychology of the Marvel inspiration. Can you come and talk about that? Which I did.
Wait, and you were already, you've done quite a few things for Marvel and DC and other companies where you get on and you do something that's a web-based video. No one had even heard of Disney Plus at the time that you were doing this. So there was no indication that this was going to be for a major...
I figured, you're right. Like I figured this would be, I don't know. I thought it was going to be a standalone full feature documentary that would be picked up and distributed in some different way. Had no idea that Disney Plus was even a thing, right? Correct, that was later announced. I'm sure that the producers had some sense of how this was going to come together, right? They just really couldn't tell me. Yeah. There was some quiet period, and then they reconnected and said like, hey, what are your, what do you want your lower third, your credit to be? And that was kind of exciting. And then the trailer came out. And by the way, you never really know when, Brian, you are actually more knowledgeable about being from the producer end of this, but I sat down for a good hour and a half. And when you do this, you never know that it could be 45 minutes of content that they use from your interview or like nothing. I mean, it could be nothing. I've been so blessed to not have that be an outcome, but I've done some things where it was like, I was a quick thing and most of the content is other people's interviews.
The Ghost Heads documentary, I sat down for over an hour and talked all about the history of Ghostbusters and 1984 and all of that, and I think I'm in like 3 seconds of the doc, which is fine with me, but
you're right, you could never really know. And what is fascinating about this type of storytelling is, at least from my perspective, I didn't know what the product would be. Mm-hmm. So I really just spoke from my experience, my training, my intellectual knowledge of the psychology of cosplay and why we're drawn to fictional characters who are superheroes and how resilience is such a common thread among those experiences, and how I personally also have that lived experience of gaining so much knowledge and inspiration from superheroes. And it was a really exciting outcome. This is a show that, I don't know, maybe there are 7 or 8 episodes. Each of the episodes is its own documentary about a particular
Facet.
idea. Yeah. And the one I'm in, I think it's episode 5.
It is.
Is it? It's called Suit Up, and it's all about, again, how characters in Marvel in particular have inspired and energized people to pursue their dreams and to dress up as the characters and to embody the psychological facets of the characters. And it's a really, really fun episode. I have to say that there are other cosplay documentaries out there, and I think this one is produced very, very nicely. Like, it's really lovely.
It's sort of following like three or so different cosplayers. It doesn't dive too much into the psychology of, but it really does follow these 3 people and their passions and why they got into it and what they love about it. And it's a really interesting look at that. I will say, your father and I were talking the other day, and he mentioned casually that, the Letamendi name is not a popular name around the world. The majority of the Letamendis that you find are going to be found in Ecuador. And so he was saying, you just don't hear that name or see that name very often. And then I pulled out my phone, went to Disney Plus, and because
you're like, here it is.
Well, because you and I tend to watch shows with the captions on, the very first thing that pops up in that episode is your last name in brackets, and then you talking about sort of the psychology of cosplay over this image of one of the young ladies getting dressed in her gear. And I'm like, that's a big deal, I think, to see in brackets Letamendi right there on a Marvel television show produced for Disney Plus, one of the major streamers this year. I would say, congratulations to
Thank you.
and to the Letamendi contingent of the world. It's a big deal.
Thank you. It was a fun project to work on, and I'm very, very happy to be a part of the show. Yeah, for sure.
You can find me. I am on Twitter at bward028, on Instagram at b_ward028. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Arkham Sessions, on Instagram at the Arkham Sessions, and on Facebook. Then come join our Patreon, where you can be a deciding voice in what we cover from this point forward. Well, maybe not from this point forward, because we already know that we're covering the next 2 movies in the Nolan trilogy and then the first season of Steven Universe, but we do throw polls out to our patrons. Also, be sure to follow our good friends and family over at Fanbase Press. Go check out their other podcasts and their news and comics. Until next time, I'm Brian Ward.
I'm Dr. Drea Letamendi.
And together we are
the Arkham Sessions.